there are a lot of these things we can get now without being married, which then gets to this question of why? Who is it for? Why do we want to get married? Is it just because we think we should? Do we have a good legal financial reason to do it? Do we have a good legal financial reason not to do it? Are there actually a lot of reasons why we shouldn't, but then we think we should because we want to be taken more seriously at work or by our family? Getting to the bottom of those questions, I think, is the important piece of this. And that's the work that a lot of people don't want to do because they just want to wave their hand and go, do it, or marriage is evil and terrible, you should never do it. I feel like people often fall into these two extremes. But there are a lot of considerations here, and thinking about those can help you make the decision of what's right for you in your life at this point in time, too, because it can also change over time. Welcome to the Multiamory podcast. I'm Jace.
I'm Emily.
And I'm Dedeker.
We believe in looking to the future of relationships, not maintaining the status quo of the past.
Whether you're monogamous, polyamorous, swinging, casually dating, or if you just do relationships differently, we see you, and we're here for you.
On this episode of the Multiamory podcast, we're talking about marriage, why you might want to do it, why you might not want to do it, as well as some special considerations for people who are non-monogamous and already married, or who are thinking about getting married, or who are thinking about opening up their marriage. Any variation of that, we're going to be talking about kind of marriage in general, unpacking what this is all about. Why do we feel the way we do about marriage? We've all got a lot of stuff we bring to this personally. We'll go through some of that as well. So if marriage is something you've ever thought about maybe considering in your life, then this is an episode for you. Also, if you're interested in learning about some of our communication tools that we reference on this show, you can check out our book, Multiamory: Essential Tools for Modern Relationships, to help you have the healthiest relationship, whether you're married or not. You can get information about that at multiamory.com/book or wherever you buy books.
Wow, marriage. It is all over the place. And that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to discuss this today. Also, just the fact that in the last few months, I've been kind of bombarded with marriage and sort of normative, ideals, and people saying things like, that's what you should do, and assuming that maybe I would want to get married someday. I went to a wedding, for instance, with one of my partners where people were kind of asking, oh, well, because you're a person of a certain age, are you going to accelerate this relationship more quickly and maybe progress up the relationship escalator more quickly because you're in your late 30s now and that's just something that you should be doing? And
I would bet none of them used the term relationship escalator or person of a certain age.
Well, I feel
like if you go to a wedding, hold on. If you go to a wedding, and if that wedding is populated by people of a certain older age,
yes,
I feel like they are legally obligated to say to people of a certain younger age, when's your turn? Or who's next? Like, there's a legal obligation now. Not a lot of people know about this, but that is why they will say it every single time without fail.
You're probably right, Dedeker, that is a legal obligation. And recently, I was working a very big event for a number of weeks. Maybe you saw it on my Instagram. And I was working for a credit card company with a bunch of very high-powered executives. And it's amazing that if you were a person of a certain age with a certain type of job where you're making quite a bit of money, that also seems like the thing that you're going to be doing, getting married and also having kids. And it kind of screwed with me a little bit. It made me wonder and question my own life choices because I feel like so non-normative at times. And it made me definitely question and wonder, am I doing the right thing here by not wanting those things necessarily in the capacity that some people do? This is what everybody does. So you are, a person who should be wanting those things as well. Somebody even went so far as to say, like, people who are young these days only care about themselves and they're not
Wait, somebody
growing
said
up.
that to you? Like, to
They
your
were
face?
saying it to someone else, and I was in the vicinity.
In your
because,
vicinity.
Because
Sure.
I always had to be nearby. That was that kind of job. It was like a
So you were
catering gig.
eavesdropping for 2 weeks.
Well,
yeah.
I
Okay.
couldn't not because the room that we
yeah.
were in was teeny weeny.
Right.
Yeah, but the person was basically saying that, kids these days aren't getting married and they're not having children, and they need to just grow up and do those things, and they're acting selfish because they're not getting married and having kids. And that really rubbed me the wrong way because I don't agree with that, but it also made me stop and be like, am I selfish?
And were you like, well, if you lower the interest rate of my credit card, maybe I'll have more disposable income to have, say, a wedding or
Not wrong.
have children, if that's what I want.
Yes,
Boy,
not
oh
wrong.
boy.
I didn't say that, but I should have. There you go. So what do you two think about this subject? Just getting married in general, being normative in general in this way that like seems to be prescribed for everyone. We're all just taught at a young age that this is the thing that we should be doing. And if you go against that grain, it can be really challenging.
I do think it's really interesting because I've definitely had conversations with people over the last several years about marriage and about commitment, because those things often come up if you talk about non-monogamy or polyamory, kind of these like, well, but what about commitment? What about marriage? Is it just being selfish? Is it just wanting to have your cake and eat it too? Some of these things we've talked about before. I always like to say, what's the point of having cake if you're not going to eat it? But aside from that, I do think that is an interesting and maybe a bit surprising perspective, that to equate not getting married or not having kids with being selfish. And in one way, if we were to say that if we all agreed that your sort of obligation to society is to have kids and keep the population increasing, and then if you decided not to do that because that sounds like a lot of work, yeah, I guess if you're assuming those things, sure, that's selfish. To say like, sure, everyone in this group project is working, but I'm not going to work. I'll just have fun instead. Like, yeah, I could see that. That sounds like selfishness. But it's based on this assumption that that's what we all should be doing and that the world is better if we're all doing that. And that's the part that I think is harder for people to question, or at least is less common for people to question, right? That like, but why is that normal? Why is that what you should do? And that's, I think, a little bit of what we're going to get into in this episode. But it's a hard one because if you ask people, they'll get very defensive about that question if they haven't already thought about it some. They'll be like, but what do you mean? Why? Like, and they'll try to come up with stuff. Like one of the ones I've heard recently about marriage is this idea that, well, if you're not married, then as soon as anything goes wrong, you can just break up and leave this person. And there's sort of no commitment there. You're not really seriously committing to trying to make this relationship work. And I think it's a little bit of a weak argument, and it's sort of based in some assumptions about what keeps people in relationships. But it's interesting, though, that is something that comes up when people try to think of like, why is marriage important to me, when they've maybe never thought about that before, or at least not critically. That's like one of the reasons I see people reach for is this like, oh, well, you're committing to someone else even when things are hard, assuming that when people date without being married, they're not doing that.
How about you, Dedeker?
Yeah, for me, this very much relates to how normative or non-normative you are seems to often change depending on the room that you're in. And
Very
the
true.
example that I often cite for people is that when I am around like kinky people, I am by far usually the most vanilla, like boringest person in the room. And then when I'm around my more normie friends, I am the weirdo, right? Because I'm like non-monogamous, right? And like also very knowledgeable about kink and this whole culture, right? And so by default, I'm the weirdest person. And I think the same thing happens with like the normativeness of marriage to a certain extent, where I do have a lot of married couple friends who, got married young and they've been having kids and just doing the whole very normie thing for a long time. And so then I feel like a weirdo. But then in other spaces, I feel like less of a weirdo, when I'm around all my friends who are not married, right? Or who haven't been married for years or don't intend to get married and things like that.
For sure. No, I think that's a very good point and something that would be good for me to realize, because I also was in this situation with a very specific group of people that pretty much all worked for these like high-powered companies. And that is probably going to attract a certain amount of normalcy more than potentially like a tech job might, maybe.
I don't know, though. I think we'll get into this more later, but it's like, marriage is this social marker, I think, especially for men of, oh, yeah, you're normal and you're dependable and you're trustable and we can trust you with responsibility more so than like a single man in the workplace might get.
That's true. But it's amazing how many of those men were also talking about like, oh, yeah, I can't wait to get away from my wife for the weekend. I heard that a lot, too.
Sure.
Oh, yeah, the classic.
Absolutely. The old ball and chain.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
There's a real contradiction that can happen there for sure.
Oh, yeah. So let's dive in a little bit and talk first about why somebody might want to get married. Because there's a lot of research out there, a lot of different statistics and polls and things that are done on married people. And I think the government, not to get too, anti-establishment or whatever here, but I do think that the government really wants us to get married. Or somebody like out there, society at large is saying, let's get married, people. Let's do it. The Pew Research Center found that 53% of U.S. adults aged 18 and older are married. And that's down from 58% in 1995. So that woman who said it was selfish, she is right that it is down now in terms of younger people not maybe getting married as
okay, but that doesn't
used
mean
to.
that it's selfish. We're
I
making a false
agree.
equivalency.
I'm
Right,
not
false
saying that
equivalency.
she's right about that, but I am saying that she's correct that people are getting married less now. Over the same amount of time, Americans who are cohabiting, that has risen from 3% to 7%. And today, 18% of adults younger than 30 are married, compared with 31% in 1995. That's a big decrease. Among adults ages 30 to 49 and those 50 and older, 62% are married, down somewhat from 1995 when marriage rates in these age groups were 68 and 65%.
Okay, so like a few percentage points down in those, but that primarily in this youngest age group, there's significantly fewer people being married, but a significant-ish increase in the amount of people who are cohabiting without being married.
That's true.
What's interesting is when you look at those numbers, so we went from 58% of adults 18 and older being married in 95 down to 53. That's what, a 5% difference?
Mm-hmm.
And then we have cohabiting going from 3% up to 7%, which is a 4% increase. So it seems to imply that like we've almost corrected by the same amount. Like maybe these people who would have gotten married before are now just cohabiting instead without getting remarried.
There you go.
Right? Because we had a 5% decrease in one and a 4% increase in the other. It's almost like those might be balancing each other out.
Maybe. Among adults ages 18 to 44, the share who have ever cohabited, which is 59%, is now larger than the share who have ever been married. And that's 50%.
Huh.
That makes sense to me. People are choosing to cohabit before getting married, and they may wait to get married probably a lot longer than they used to.
Yeah.
You know what's so interesting? In my Christian upbringing, living together before you were married was so
not okay.
demonized.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so they would trot out this research, and I don't remember where this research comes from, so I'm just completely pulling this out of the air. But they would always cite this research that shows that, when people live together before they get married, they're less likely to get married, right? Like they're more likely to break up. And I do think it's legitimate research because I'm like, you live with someone and then you realize what their cleaning habits are like and what it's like to be around them all the time. And so that's probably a good thing that then you decided to not get married to them.
But that's really funny and interesting to me that they're like, so don't live together because then you won't get married.
Exactly.
Well, yes. So growing up, I heard a similar study, but different. And again, don't know where this is coming from. I'm pulling this straight out of my butt. And that is that people who lived together before getting married were more likely to break up, meaning more likely to get divorced.
Yeah.
Again, have no idea what the source was on that or if that was true, but that's the one I remember hearing as a kid. But maybe it was actually break up, but my parents interpreted that to mean, oh, that must mean they got divorced rather than they broke up before they got married. I'm not sure. But it is another interesting example of if the assumption is that the good outcome is getting married and staying married, then you could look at that and go, this is a bad thing. People are living together sooner. and they're more likely to break up before they get married. Therefore, that's bad.
Yeah.
Like if we've kind of pre-agreed
that marriage
the
is
good
good
outcome is getting married and staying married. And so I think that's what's so core to a lot of this is based around these assumptions of what is good, what is the right thing to do. And that's the hardest part to unpack. So I think that's just something to keep in mind as we look at all of this of like what might be those assumptions going on in the researchers or the respondents or anyone involved in these studies.
Well, those two statistics are very different than a decade ago when 54% of adults in this age group had ever cohabited and then 60% had ever married. So it kind of switched a little bit. Like now, many more people are just cohabiting, like you said, as opposed to getting married. And a decade ago, that wasn't the case.
But to be honest, the fact that in the 90s it was still 54% seems a lot higher than my Christian upbringing would have led me to believe was normal.
Well, again,
that's
it's
still
the
a majority
circles
of
in
people,
which you
right?
run, right? Yeah, as opposed to maybe what society at large was doing at that time in these more conservative Christian circles, doing that, living together before marriage wouldn't be seen as okay. Or maybe they were seeing that it was on an upward trend and they're like, no, don't do that thing.
Right.
And although cohabitation is widely viewed as acceptable, the public still sees the societal benefits of marriage. So a slight majority of Americans, 53%, say that society is better off if couples who want to stay together long-term eventually get married, while 46% say that society is just as well off if they decide not to marry. That's interesting. Like society is better off, whatever that means.
Right. That's what we're getting at here is there is this interesting, just society says this is what you should do.
Was it a society of wedding planners? Was it
That's
a
a good
society of event venues?
Yeah.
Well, I guess
I would agree that society would be better off.
Sure.
I do want it to be clear, though, that this episode is not about saying, oh, well, society says you should get married, so you shouldn't. There are things that society says you should do that, at least for myself, I think are great, and it's nice that we do them, and I would say it's better when we do them.
Don't poop on the street.
Don't poop on the street's a good one. Not eating with your hands at a restaurant. It's like, that doesn't really actually affect anyone. There's no like objective way I could say that is inherently worse than eating with silverware. But we've all agreed that's how we do it, and I do think it's nice to go along with that unless you have a good reason not to. Or even just like saying excuse me or please and thank you, or like there's all sorts of things that we just have agreed upon as a society somehow. These are good things and not doing them is bad. So like there is a case for that. I'm not so convinced that marriage is that because of a lot of what we're going to get into later about all of the legal and financial ramifications of it and, things that people will talk your ear off about, like it upholding patriarchy or that it being about ownership and capitalism or about colonialism or, all sorts of things like that. Yes, it's got some bad history to it as well. But I just want to be clear that we're not saying just because everyone says you should do it means you shouldn't. This isn't that type of episode, although I love to have that discussion sometime too.
I think one of the big things that people cite about marriage is that it will make you happier overall. And I don't know if that's actually the case, but there are a lot of different polls and stuff done on that very fact, quote unquote. For instance, the Institute for Family Studies, now, okay, take that with a grain of salt, please. But they did a fairly long longitudinal study from 2008 to 2020. They collected data from basically 2.5 million U.S. adults, mostly via phone surveys. And then they collected an additional 56,000 surveys between March 2020 and November 2023. And they found that adults who are married are by far the happiest, as measured by how they evaluate their current and future life. And so in 2023, married adults ages 25 to 50 are 17 percentage points more likely to be thriving than adults who never married, up from 12 percentage points in 2009. I don't know what thriving is. that's going to be probably different for...
Is it just self-reporting
I
as
guess,
thriving?
yeah, like I'm thriving because I'm married.
I guess I'd have to see, like, how are they measuring that, or how are they reporting that?
Yeah.
And also, what's the order of the questions?
That's true. All of the above.
This is always something I think is so important. If you imagine being asked the questions of, how are you feeling about your life? How happy are you? How fulfilled do you feel? And then later saying, are you married? How long have you been married? Asking you those sorts of questions. Or if it's the other way around, if it went, are you married? Yes. And then immediately after, how happy are you? Would you say you're thriving? That I think there can be more of a like, yeah, I'm happy. I'm married. I'm doing great. Like the ordering of how you ask questions does affect the outcome.
Absolutely. From a psychological standpoint. They found that people who are persistently happier or have attributes that tend to generate and sustain happiness, such as character traits like agreeableness, emotional stability, and conscientiousness, may be more likely to seek out marriage and may be more likely to receive marriage proposals. They said marital status is not randomly assigned. Okay.
I do think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's pretty funny.
And if we try to think about it, on the one hand, sure, if you're a nicer person to get along with, I guess more people would want to marry you. Sure, I guess so, right? It's more likely someone dating you is going to go, yeah, this person's
rad,
nice, easy to get along with. Cool, I want to be married to them. But I could also see that, their traits, specifically they mentioned agreeableness and conscientiousness, which, depending how you measure those, could mean conscientiousness, could mean I want to be very aware of what society expects of me, and I'm going to conscientiously do those things.
Sure.
Maybe it also means you're more likely to score as being more conscientious if you also score as being more normative.
Yeah.
So again, it depends how you measure those things. It's all very, very interesting.
And just to kind of throw out there probably who was answering these questions in the study, the data showed that Republicans are significantly more likely to be thriving in their well-being compared to Democrats and independents by 9 to 12 percentage points. And likewise, people with a religious preference are more likely to be thriving than atheists, agnostics, and those with no preference by 6 percentage points. Yet controlling for these things does not lower the effect of marriage, even though married people are more likely to be both Republican and religious. And seen.
That tracks with what we can pick up from just looking at culture.
Yeah, no, for sure. So, if you're a thriving Republican religious person who is married, like you've got life on lock is basically what I'm hearing from this poll.
Fascinating. Okay, a little bit later in this episode, we're going to get into some different studies that have some contradictory information. But first, do we want to take a moment and just talk about what are some actual reasons why you might want to get married? Like if we're being real about it, what are some reasons you might want to get married?
I think the big one that everyone tosses out is like the financial benefits, right? Because ultimately this is an economic arrangement. It historically has always been an economic arrangement and it still is, right? This is true in many places around the globe, but of course our focus is specifically on the United States, where there's a possibility that you may end up in a lower tax bracket with your combined incomes. You get higher standard deductions. There's the reality that when you have two incomes, you have more spending power and more opportunities. Now, of course, people don't have to be married to have multiple incomes that they take advantage of, right? And of course, we have the whole joke about how, monogamy in this economy, that yes, we know that having multiple incomes means that you have access to more money straight up. But when you're married, I think that the culture and the infrastructure expects the multiple incomes more so, in the sense of thinking about trying to get a mortgage, for instance, right? The process is different if you're married with multiple incomes versus if you're a single person with just one income. There's things like, a married couple can donate about twice as much money as a single taxpayer without triggering federal gift taxes or estate taxes. Spouses can contribute to each other's IRA accounts if one of them is not earning a paycheck. If you own a home with a married partner, you can pocket more of the proceeds from the sale of your property. And also, you can qualify for your spouse's Social Security benefits if you don't have a job when you turn 62. And that's just a tiny smattering of some of the financial benefits that tend to come along with getting married. Of course, when we also start to get into things like raising children together, that also expands some of the logistical legal benefits that come along with that.
aside from those financial reasons, there are also emotional, relational reasons. And that is, Dedeker mentioned for a long time, since its inception, marriage has been a financial contractual agreement between two people or two families, to be honest. But in our modern day, we've now wrapped this whole love thing into it, which it did not start with. No, I'm just saying, we added that later on. We added this love part. That was not part of the marriage contract in the beginning. So within married and cohabiting adults, love is cited number one. It is the most common reason people cite for getting married or moving in with a partner. So 90% of those who are married and 73% of those people living with a partner say love was a major factor in those decisions. That doesn't surprise me at all. But basically, there is that part of like, oh, well, I love this person, so that's what I should do, what I want to do, question mark, which is it? Is it that I think I should, or is it that I want to? Also, people mention that they're seen as more adult by their peers and their family members. This goes to what Emily was saying about the people at the wedding that she went to, talking about it like, well, don't you want to do this? When it comes to business, like Dedeker mentioned, being seen as more stable, more trustworthy, those sorts of things, basically being seen as more adult. That one definitely comes up. Another one is that your spouse is seen as another family member rather than just someone you're dating. So in cases where you might not always assume that your person you're dating would be your plus one, or that you would always expect to get a plus one for them to events, if you're married, well, then obviously I get a plus one for them. It's like you get to take advantage of more of those assumptions, I guess, about people getting invited to things with you. I would also extend this to say that your family or their family would then look at your partner as family more than they would otherwise, of just, oh, this is someone that my child is dating or my brother is dating or something like that, that now it's, oh, this person is part of our family. And then, of course, religion and other value systems is a big part of why people get married.
And there's a lot of practical reasons to get married, like raising kids. As a child of a single mother, I'm sure that having an additional person there would have been easier for sure. I did have my grandmother living with us for the majority of my life, which was awesome. And think if you had even more extended family or an additional partner or something like that there to help raise children, I do think that that's a reason why a lot of people choose to get married.
The family piece there is key too, right? In your case, it was a grandmother who's still like legally a family relation of yours. True. Whereas if it's a parent's partner that's not married to them, there's certain areas where it can be a little trickier or more difficult for them to support as much when it comes to like school things and hospital and legal stuff. So that's part of it. Because otherwise you could get that just with any group of people. But there are certain things that become easier with marriage.
For sure. And marriage generally allows for more financial stability than being single. I do think that you are able to maybe benefit from a partner's finances in certain situations, but when you are married, you are legally tied to that person.
You're also legally tied to their money in many cases.
Exactly. And for better or for worse, like
which could also be bad.
Exactly. I mean, if somebody has a lot of debt, for example, then that could be maybe not particularly beneficial for you in a financial sense. But for the most part, I would assume that you are marrying together finances, and therefore, from a practical standpoint, that would be a plus. Also, things like health insurance, a lot of benefits are afforded to spouses that may not be afforded to a person who's just dating or multiple partners who are together, for example. And, some people really genuinely need access to good health insurance, and you wouldn't have it unless you were married to somebody who had a nice job that can afford them a really good health insurance. Leave benefits are also awarded to your spouse if they're ill or if someone in their family passes away. The company that I was talking about that I was working for, they were talking about the fact that the parental leave for just having a kid is 5 months for both people. So not just for like the person who had the kid, but also the spouse. So that's incredible. And if you're working like a job that doesn't afford that, I mean, that kind of sucks. That's really difficult. So both people get that option and that opportunity.
I will say that having to be married to get insurance benefits is a lot less common of a requirement now than it used to be, that
That is great.
Often you do have to live together. That can still be a requirement sometimes, sometimes not. But I do find that this one is less of a thing than it used to be. However, stuff like parental leave, if you're not legally the parent of that child that's just been born, which generally would be through marriage, then whether you could actually get those benefits is probably a lot less likely.
For sure. Spouses also get legal decision-making benefits like next of kin or power of attorney. And if you or your spouse are ill, then it's much easier to be able to see them in a hospital setting, for instance, than if you were just a friend or if you were not married or if you weren't a member of the family. Married people tend to get that access immediately. And if you are a friend, that becomes much, much more difficult.
We've probably talked about this on past episodes about planning for death and estate planning and things like that. But that's something that came up a lot when I was recently going through, getting my will planned out and everything with a polyamory friendly attorney who is fantastic. But one of the things she pointed out is if you're married and you die, everything by default goes to your spouse. If you're not married, though, nothing goes to your partner.
Oh,
unless you've specifically tried to put things in to make it so they get stuff, it will go whoop right past them to your next of kin, which is going to be your parents, first of all. And if not them, then it might be siblings or other nearest relatives. There's a whole system for figuring out who the next of kin is.
Well, same thing for who determines what your funeral is going to be like, or
all that stuff.
How you want your body to be dealt with, right? And I think people don't realize that may fall into the hands of your bigoted parents, for instance, who you're estranged from, right?
Absolutely.
Right. And that even if you've lived with this person for years and years and years, they are basically non-existent in the eyes of estate law. So that's another one there too.
Finally, in addition to all those research studies about people being really happy and happier if they are married than single, there's also a lot of studies out there about people having health benefits if they are married. And again, I don't necessarily take these at face value.
Wait, by health benefits, you mean physical benefits to their health?
Exactly.
Not health insurance.
That people live longer and they are, mentally happier. So therefore they are physically better off than their single counterparts. There's just a lot of studies out there that will say that this is the case. And again, I don't know that that's necessarily the case, but one has to look at okay, are these people happy being single and that's fine with them and they're still getting great benefits from being single and having other important relationships in their lives? Or are these people very lonely and they're longing for a relationship like a marriage or, a long-term committed something that would potentially help them be happier and therefore physically get some benefits from that as well? You just don't really know what these studies are implying or who they're speaking to. And it's difficult to just have a blanket statement from that standpoint that married people are always going to be healthier and happier.
Which is a good segue into some other studies that we want to talk about here. So as I mentioned, there have also been some studies that have shown contradictory information about marriage and happiness, as well as some that have shown kind of a neutral effect. So one that we're not going to go into detail about, but as far as the health stuff goes, that one of the criticisms of those studies is they tend to look at people who are either married or not married, but who want to be married. And so saying that wanting to be married, and often they have that as someone who was married and is now divorced, that they had lower health, things like that, that it's often tied to someone who does wish they were married, though. And so it kind of leaves out people who were not married because they did not plan to get married or don't want to get married. That once you calculate for that, all those effects go away. All of those negative effects of being single go away if you're doing it by choice. But the one we want to talk about here is this 2011 study by a group of authors led by Bella DePaulo, who looked at 18 different long-term studies of happiness and marriage to see whether getting married actually makes you happier. And I guess, spoiler alert, the answer is no. So in all 18 studies, what they did was they looked at asking people about their well-being. So that's happiness, life satisfaction, satisfaction with their relationship before they got married, and then continuing to ask them those same questions for some time after they got married. So doing a longitudinal study over time, And they found no evidence that getting married results in lasting increases in happiness or life satisfaction over time. So probably it spiked up a little bit after the marriage. We're all excited about it, but then it levels back out to where it was before, essentially. They also found that a lot of these studies only include people who got married and stayed married. And so when they look at people who got married and then ended up getting divorced, they actually show that their happiness decreases over the course of being married, and that their happiness doesn't go back up until quite a while after that divorce has happened. So actually that person ends up with a net negative much more significant than if they had just stayed single that entire time. And then they also mentioned things like the group of people who choose to get married versus the people who stay single by choice, and that those people are just different people. And so you can't always correlate one piece of data with the other, right? Because the people who get married chose to get married, obviously, so they've already self-selected for this. Kind of like the Pew Research study said that marriage is not randomly assigned.
They were onto something, actually.
I think they were saying it in a little more of a snarky way of like only good people get married. But I think that there is this, it's not randomly assigned. And so any data you're pulling from it, you're not really able to say marriage is what caused this, because we can't randomly assign people to the married group or the not married group.
I mean, the same way that we can spend all this time making arguments in favor of marriage, or even if you're non-monogamous, of course, there's a big case to be made against legal marriage, right? And, one of the big things is that these days you can do most of the things that married people do without actually needing to get married. You can raise a child together with someone or multiple someones. You can live together with someone or multiple someones. You can choose to entangle finances. It's become less common that legal marriage is a requirement in order to take advantage of a partner's health insurance. So, we can't deny that our culture has been shifting, and that's a good thing, right? Because not everybody wants to get married necessarily. And so it's better for us to be affording the same rights that we give to married people to people who are single or people who are partnered but just don't want to get married necessarily.
We've still got a long way to go, but it's at least getting a little better.
Yeah, we do have a long way to go. Of course, we can all look at the divorce rate. I think a lot of us millennials were children of divorce. And I do think that that's probably helped to plant a seed for many of us of being maybe more cautious, we could argue, choosing to wait longer to get married, choosing to not get married at all, choosing to do entirely different things with our relationships. But the divorce rate is still around 40 to 50%. And getting divorced is still difficult. It's still costly, no matter how amicable it is. Of course, we also have to take the angle that marriage still isn't legal for a lot of queer people in many, many countries, and it may not even be an option where you live. Of course, marriage is still not legal for non-monogamous people. There's anti-bigamy laws that have been on the books for hundreds of years. And then on top of that, the progress that we have made with things like same-sex marriage, there's still a threat to that. It is not necessarily rooted in the bedrock of our particular country, right? So it's like marriage rights for anyone who is not heterosexual is still a little bit dicey, right? It's not something we can just relax into. Of course, I think the one that comes up for me the most is just looking at the sordid history of marriage, that there's no arguing against the fact that it is a patriarchal and heteronormative institution. And while I do think people can and should be empowered to interface with that institution in a way that makes it feel like this is on their own terms, right? At the same time, it's still unappealing because of just the history that's baked into it. And then I think a big one is that people get married, and I think especially nowadays where we do have marriage wrapped up a lot in love and commitment, people choose to get married without looking at what divorce laws are in their state. And this makes sense because I'm assuming if you're getting married, you're feeling very optimistic, like we're not going to get divorced. And I can understand the thinking behind that, but what you're literally doing is entering into a legal contract, a legal financial contract that you have not read the fine print on.
Which in any other context would be absurd, right?
Sure.
No one would say, oh, yeah, just sign it. It's fine.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean once you read the fine print, you're going to choose to not get married. But it's just good to read the fine print and just know exactly what you're getting into, even if you're feeling optimistic.
Now, I will say the fine print for this is actually hard to find and varies by state.
Do they hand you a contract when you're married?
No.
I bet they don't.
That's part of what's so messed up about this thing.
Yeah.
You sign a piece of paper saying you're getting married, and no one ever checks to say,
what does that
do
mean?
you actually know what this means for you financially, legally? And then what happens if you get divorced? Like, no one makes you do that, which is ridiculous. It's honestly shocking when I really step back and think about it.
Now, if you're looking at marriage through the non-monogamous lens, marriage might just not be something that you want to partake in. We definitely know of a lot of non-monogamous individuals who are married and who have then chosen to divorce because they want to make their relationship seem less intrinsically hierarchical. I think that makes a lot of sense because there is this sort of hierarchy that happens with a person if they are a spouse. And getting away from that is really difficult. Even if you say we are non-hierarchical, everyone is equal, all of those things, there's still going to be kind of that inherent idea of hierarchy if you are married to another person. And in this country, at least in America, marriage and benefits are still really only available to one person at a time. Now, the Pew Research survey that we've been talking about a number of times throughout this episode, they found that the vast majority of Americans still think that it's acceptable for an unmarried couple to live with another person, for unmarried people to live together. Most Americans say cohabitation is acceptable even if the couple doesn't plan to get married, while another 16% say that it's acceptable, but only if the couple plans to marry. And then 14% say that it's never acceptable. So that's probably the people, Jason Dedeker, who you were interfacing with as young people who were like, it's never acceptable.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And I think that all of those things kind of tie into this idea, well, we got to go against that. We got to go against the grain. We've got to be able to be in the relationships that we want to be in and not necessarily do the normative thing of getting married. We can still have meaningful relationships.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes to this question of if we're getting married, who is it for and why? Because I think Emily brings up a good point here with the majority of people saying it's acceptable for people to live together. That I think there was a time where it was this, if we want to live together, if we want to form a long-term life together, we can kind of only do that by getting married. Whereas nowadays, people tend to also agree that having children together, even if you're not married, is acceptable and is just as good. 4 in 10 say married couples do a better job of raising children than couples who are not married, but 59% say that they can raise children just as well. So that one's, I think, less of a sure thing than people generally being okay with people living together without being married, but also having children is possible, and most people support that as well. Another reason to consider not getting married, or at least putting it off, is that a lot of the benefits that get mentioned about why you would want to get married, like financial stability, you can actually get without being married, right? So, for example, about 4 in 10 people who were surveyed in that Pew Research study said that moving in with their partner was for financial reasons. They said that was a major part of their decision, was a financial reason. But when it came to why someone got married, finances was a much smaller percentage, more like 13 or 10% of people said that getting married was for financial reasons, whereas moving in together, it was more significantly for that. So just pointing out that there are a lot of these things we can get now without being married, which then gets to this question of why, who is it for? Why do we want to get married? Is it just because we think we should? Do we have a good legal financial reason to do it? Do we have a good legal financial reason not to do it? Are there actually a lot of reasons why we shouldn't, but then we think we should because we want to be taken more seriously at work or by our family? Getting to the bottom of those questions, I think, is the important piece of this. And that's the work that a lot of people don't want to do because they just want to wave their hand and go, do it, or marriage is evil and terrible, you should never do it. I feel like people often fall into these two extremes. But there are a lot of considerations here, and thinking about those can help you make the decision of what's right for you in your life at this point in time too, because it can also change over time.
I wanted to check in with our community about marriage and why or why not some of them chose to get married. And it was amazing because so many people contributed to this section. I really got a lot of people just wanting to discuss why they like the idea of marriage or why they don't, and why that might be a social stigma for them, especially if they are non-monogamous. Because I do think that there's a lot of interesting implications and ideas that come up when you're non-monogamous about, should I get married or should I not? Am I going to be seen as other in this community if I choose to get married? And kind of what the implications of that are. So I just really appreciate all the insight that this specific group of people who are non-monogamous gave to me and gave to this episode.
So, of course, a lot of the responses that we got covered stuff that we've already talked about in this episode, but there were some that were really unique. So we're going to talk about people who are making the cases for getting married and the people who made the cases against getting married. And in the for column, one person shared just love. I want to show a certain level of commitment to friends and family. Very similarly, someone else shared that there is a certain magic in public commitment, and this idea of bringing people together to celebrate and honor your union. So it seems like that's specifically about having a wedding, in particular, having a very visible marriage.
I think this goes to that question that I was trying to ask of, who's it for? And in this case, it sounds like some of the answer is for these other people, for friends and family. And I don't want to say that that's necessarily a bad thing, but I do think it's good to acknowledge how much of this is because I want those people to see it. And then to kind of ask the questions of, well, why do I want that? Is that really what I want? I think it's good to acknowledge that and to really be honest with yourself about who it's for. Not to say that that's necessarily right or wrong one way or the other.
Kind of along those lines, somebody said that they saw a big difference between when they were married and when they were not married. And there's this sense of kind of being a second-class citizen when they weren't married, and now the way in which their friends and family view them is very different. So, I mean, that sucks. That's really unfortunate. But I do think, again, that so many people see a person as more adult once they get married, and therefore, kind of the infantilizing ideas or things that they place upon that non-married person, they kind of go away when they are married.
Yeah, this is one I've really grappled with my work, and thinking about how in my work, being a sort of responsible adult is generally valued. But then there is this interesting dynamic, too, of when you are around the executives you were, Emily, where everyone's talking about being heterosexually married with their kids, that there is also this silent group of people, I'm sure, who are actually feeling more alienated by that.
You may be right.
And so it's you might have this vocal majority who now respects you more and treats you more adult, but there also might be this other group that you're now pushing away, that you're distanced from, and kind of depending on your industry and who you work with and who your friends are, you might have more or less of that, and you might be more or less aware of it. Anyway, this is something I've thought about a lot when it comes to marriage, because this is something Dedeker and I have talked about for years, of kind of what would be the legal, financial reasons to do it or not. And that's one I've wrestled with a lot of, am I making the problem worse by putting this persona out into the world and buying into this very normative view that people probably project on me anyway? Or are there situations where it's good to just take advantage of that? And that's a tough question, and one I still wrestle with.
Yeah, people mentioned one that we haven't covered yet, which is that sometimes it's just very practical for immigration, or for getting a visa that, again, whether you like it or not, the state makes particular assumptions about who deserves to come into our country, who deserves to emigrate or not, and what type of relationship deserves to be recognized or not. And sometimes that just makes things a lot faster and a lot smoother. But here's one that I also really like that's a little bit less practical. This person shared, if our marriage is a structural support beam, in this analogy, then our house is big enough for all the people that we love. I just thought that was sweet.
That is sweet.
I do think it's interesting to think about that from that point of view of, okay, am I being bad by just taking advantage of all of this kind of normative privilege you get by being married? But then there could be an argument to be made to say, yes, but that stability helps me provide for all of the people in my actually non-normative life. So that is good. I like that analogy of the tent pole or the structural support beam.
a lot of people out there discuss the fact that gay marriage or non-monogamous marriage can be seen as a political statement, and electing to use the Somerville Domestic Partnership Union as a statement about the legality of domestic partnership and seeing non-monogamous unions as okay. So that's an interesting kind of take on why one might want to get married, because you're using it as sort of like this radical political act. Because again, those things really haven't been legal in this country for very long. I think 2015 is when gay marriage became legal in this country.
I think a couple more interesting financial reasons against getting married. One is that someone brought up, as a widow, I can collect my late husband's Social Security income when I retire, but if I remarry, I forfeit that. I remember this also came up with my mom, who's retirement age, about if she remarried, she would get a Social Security benefit based off of the new husband's rather than the old husband's. And depending on their financial states, that might be different as well. So there's all these little factors. And then another one is that in the US, if you have disability insurance for yourself as a single person, if you become married, you can lose that benefit because it might be seen that your household now can support itself because you have someone to support you. So some interesting cases about not getting married for financial reasons, which usually don't get made.
Now, of course, we got a lot of people who are sharing really good arguments against, right? And first of all, I don't know which column this quite goes into, but I just wanted to put a pin in the fact that people pointed out that there can be a lot of shame in the polyamorous community about marriage or about wanting to be married, which I think the reasoning for that is people equate marriage with a very traditional relationship with traditional values. People may equate marriage with monogamy, and therefore, if you want that, you must want monogamy, and why are you here?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Essentially, I guess is maybe the thinking.
Yeah.
And so, I do think that's part of why we wanted to pull this episode together at all, is to reduce that shame and just talk about the fact that, there's a lot of reasons for and against this. I like that someone brought up that historically wedding vows have included asking women to obey their husbands specifically. And it's funny, I'm reading a book right now. I'm reading a biography of some rich artist lady in the mid 1800s, but they shared that one of her finishing school teachers refused to get married because she didn't ever want to have to say obey in her vows. Mm-hmm. And so she just never got married, and everyone just dealt with it.
Wow. Love that.
Yeah.
But of course, if this all links to what I was talking about earlier about how there's this history of the patriarchal institution, the history of it being an institution of oppression and control and men's superior status over women being property, and some people just don't even want to get close to that, which I totally understand.
Somebody who had been married before but then has chosen to not get married again said that I don't want to date to marry anymore. I want to date to find people who fill my life with joy and laughter. So they're kind of keeping the focus on what matters to them. And so many people out there really do date in order to find somebody to get married to. And I love that idea that no, I'm dating because I want to find really special people to fill my life with. And that is what matters to me and what is more important to me than just this idea of getting married.
Certainly. Yeah, I think that for a lot of people, the goal-orientedness of getting married, and I'd say also of having children, can often get us so focused on the goal that we don't take the time to really focus on just the relationship as it is and what we get from it as it is. And so often people get to that state where they've accomplished all those goals, and then suddenly there's that, oh shit, now what?
Yeah.
I haven't really invested in this thing giving me happiness for its own sake. I've been goal-oriented, and maybe we're a good team and we've really fought for those goals together, but that's not really what a good relationship is based on. And so I like that idea of choosing not to even be looking for marriage so that you can stay focused on what really matters more in those relationships. That said, I do think it's worth acknowledging that for a lot of people, I'm sure some of you have already turned off this episode because of this, but there are a lot of people who take this harder line of no, until marriage doesn't have this monogamous focused legal privilege that's only for these people who choose to get monogamously married, I will never support it, and I will not support anyone's choice to do it. I think it's just inherently wrong because you're upholding this terrible system. And yeah, I mean, I get it. I don't take that hard line myself. I think that we have the tools that we have and we got to make our choices within those. But I do want to acknowledge that, yeah, that is fair to say, yeah, you are, by doing this, kind of upholding this system that sucks, that has a shitty history and has a shitty present, right? That's still a problem. I think that if you are going to go into that, at least being aware of those things and trying to think about what you are doing. Like, are you just taking this as an advantage and just not worrying about the fact that you're upholding this? Or are you looking at, why am I really choosing to do this? Do I have a good reason? And am I also doing other things to try to support the change that I want to see in society and legally, financially, all of those things?
I want to leave you all with something that Dr. Kiana Nurse, who has done some research help on some of our prior episodes, said about marriage, because she is married and yet she doesn't live with the partner that she's married to. And she said, I primarily enjoy the economic benefits of marriage, even as my husband lives with another partner and I live alone. Thank you, tax and healthcare advantages. So even if I were to get divorced, which my husband and I discuss every year on our anniversary, I love that, by the way, kind of like a check-in on the marriage explicitly, which is different than our relationship check-ins, I would be open to remarrying to enjoy those similar tax and healthcare benefits. I don't think being married presents negative challenges, but it does invite me to never stop questioning how power and privilege function within my polycule, and to do my best at creating and maintaining equity-driven and empowering relationships for everyone I'm involved with. Concretely, that has involved some very explicit conversations around resource distribution. For example, if my husband and I are paying lower taxes because we're married, how do we redistribute those funds so that other relationships and partners can benefit too? It also animated conversations around social visibility and privilege. I'm happy to be married to someone who is willing to imagine and live marriage on our own terms, to challenge assumptions around who is to be included and made visible to friends and family and work, and even to question assumptions around the entitlement and access folks presume we have to each other because we're married. As far as I'm concerned, our marriage doesn't really look like the cultural models I see of it, whether I'm in monogamous or non-monogamous circles, and I'm very glad that's the case. Amen. That's awesome. I love that You can do marriage, go for it, absolutely, but let's do it with integrity and kind of questioning and looking at the structure as a whole and how it may benefit you versus another partner, and what can I do to help make all relationships more equitable and do the things that are serving everyone as opposed to just the couple that are married. So we want to hear from all of you about this episode, what you thought about us talking about marriage, pros and the cons. And we have a question of the week, which is going to be on our Instagram stories. And that is, if you are non-monogamous and married, why did you choose to get married? I'm very interested to hear some of y'all's stories out there about why you wanted to get married, and if you are still married, because I think a lot of people are choosing to maybe decouple in that way. Or maybe some of you out there just love being married and it's great for your relationships, regardless of whether you're monogamous or not. And the best place to share your thoughts with other listeners is in the episode discussion channel in our Discord server, or you can post in our private Facebook group. You can get access to these groups and join our exclusive community by going to multiamory.com/join. In addition, you can share with us publicly on Instagram at multiamory_podcast. Multiamory is created and produced by Jace Lindgren, Dedeker Winston, and me, Emily Matlack. Our production assistants are Rachel Shennework and Carson Collins. Our theme song is Forms I Know I Did by Josh and Anand from the Fractal Cave EP. The full transcript is available on this episode's page on multiamory.com.